Chapter 3 is all about financial statements and ratio analysis. And I want to start off with this concept right here. Ms. Perry and I were talking earlier about how we track our health. One of the things we do is measure our weight. I weigh every morning. Now, do you think I do a better job of controlling my weight than someone who, say, weighs once a month? Yeah. Because what happens when I start to see, I know this sounds really geeky, my weight has been trending down for the last 3 days because I've been eating apples for dessert instead of crab. And I feel really good. And that tells me that my change in my diet is actually impacting things. And we're going to see that the same thing is true in business. If you don't, by the way, I used to not measure my weight. Have I told you guys I used to weigh like 30 pounds more? Oh yeah, and I've kept it off for 19 years now. So my point to you is this: the more you measure something, the more you pay attention to it. Example, the speed limit here. Why do you guys even drive anything close to the speed limit?
Because we have a speedometer.
Because you have a speedometer. You're a good citizen. Who else?
Fear of the police.
Fear of the police. And we're back to monitoring, right? They're measuring, and so that actually gets managed. Does that make sense? And since gas prices went up, I started paying attention to my gas mileage. And do you think it's gotten better as a result? Yeah, and far fewer people flip me off. So, it's an added benefit right there. Okay, so what gets measured gets managed. And we'll talk some more about that as we roll through here. So the first thing we want to do is talk about why we're interested in this kind of stuff. And the answer is we need to be able to make comparisons. And we're wanting to make comparisons between similar firms at the same time and at the same firm over different periods. And I'll explain to you why that's important. So, for example, I used to work for a small plastics manufacturing concern. And we bought our raw materials in 20 kilogram bags, which is like 55 pounds. And it's because our business was small, our orders were small, everything was small. Now, our competitors across town, a company called Poly One, they were a huge publicly traded company. Now, how did they buy their materials? They bought their materials 40,000 pounds at a time. Tells you, by the way, that's what a rail car holds, 40,000 pounds. It tells you there's a huge difference in the scale between these two operations. Now, my question to you is, would it be fair to look at our sales and compare them to Poly One's sales and say, phew, we stink? No. Would it be fair to look at our net income and say we stink? Absolutely not. All these numbers are going to be vastly different. And so what we need to do is have some way to put them in an apples-to-apples comparison where we are comparing them on an even and fair footing. Also, we can see that this can happen over time at a company. So, Apple, last time I checked, the company was worth over, $1 trillion? Was that it? Over $1 trillion? Now, roll back to 1996. Apple's nearly bankrupt. Do you think it was worth nearly $1 trillion then? No, I probably could have bought it with what was in my checking account, right? It was pathetic. And then Steve Jobs came back, and then hallelujah, everything turned around, right? So would it make sense for us to look purely at the net income over at Apple over time and say, wow, the net income's trending up, so they must be doing great? No, maybe. The only reason the net income is trending up is because of this enormous growth in the assets. Maybe they've been growing faster, the company's been growing faster than the profits, which might indicate a problem. So that's why we have to have these abilities for both the same company over time and different companies at the same time. We have to be able to adjust for that. So what's the first and easiest way to get there? We're going to start with something called common size financial statements. Someone please name a financial statement for me.
Income statement.
Income statement, very good. And what was yours? Oh, anyone else?
Balance sheet.
Very good. Those are the two big ones that we're going to talk about, the balance sheet and the income statement. And by the way, if you don't know what those are, you need to watch my Chapter 2 videos And otherwise, you're going to have a lot of trouble with the Chapter 2 homework, which is homework 2. Okay, now we just got through saying that we can't look at these companies and just compare the different things on the balance sheets or the income statements, so we've got to figure out some way to try to put these on a more even footing. And the way we do that is through creating something called common size financial statements. And the way we're going to do that is by finding one number on each of these financial statements and dividing everything else on there by that number. And so everything basically comes up as a fraction or a percentage of that thing. And for the balance sheet, it's really easy. What do we divide everything by? Total assets. We divide everything by total assets, and that way everything on that asset side is in percentage of the assets, and so is everything on the liabilities and owner's equity side. So that's real easy. The income statement is a little more difficult because the number that we divide everything by, which we say total sales here, it's basically the top line of the income statement, the money that's flowing in. And it's known by many different names. It could be total sales, total operating revenue, total consulting revenue. There's all sorts of things there. And for retail, instead of saying total sales, we say net sales. Can someone tell me the difference between total sales and net sales?
It's earning after interest and taxes.
Ah, swing and a miss. You're talking about earnings before interest.
Interest and after.
Yeah, okay. So it's sales minus returns. Sales minus returns is net sales.
Oh, yes.
Sales minus returns is net sales. Now, if I'm selling something like hydrochloric acid, and my manufacturing process is good, how much do you think I have in terms of returns? Almost zero, right? So some products, total sales is perfectly fine. Now let's talk about why net sales is necessary for retail. My wife likes to shop on Amazon. My wife is small for an American, but large for a Chinese person. She's not Chinese, by the way, but it fits into the story. So out there, if you guys have been looking at the clothes on Amazon lately, a lot of them are made in China and sold by Chinese people, right? And so in American sizes, she's small, but in Chinese sizes, she's either extra large, extra large, or extra large, right? But she doesn't know which of those she is. But these clothes have prime and free returns, so what does she do?
Buys all three.
She buys all three, and then what?
She returns what doesn't fit.
Yeah, she returns what doesn't fit, or if she doesn't like it at all, she returns them all. And so at most, she's going to keep 1/3 of the clothes that she orders, unless it's a reorder, right? Something that she really liked that she ordered again. She might return 100%. And so that's why it's so important at retail to look at net sales instead of total sales. Any questions so far? Okay, so let me throw some questions at you here, and you can tell me. And by the way, these are questions you might see on an exam. Number one, what would I divide by to find the common size financial statement value for cost of goods sold? What would I divide by? Where is, first question you got to answer in your head. What statement does cost of goods sold show up on? The income statement. And we divide everything on the income statement by
Total sales.
sales. And so that's your answer. It takes 2 steps of thinking, right? You got to figure out where it is. What if I said deferred taxes? Which one would deferred taxes show up on? It's a little trickier. Where do we find deferred taxes? On the balance sheet, right? And so what are we going to divide those by?
Total assets.
Yeah, total assets, because it's on the balance sheet. And so that's one of the ways that we test this material, other than by having you actually calculate things. Now, do you think those are the only 2 things I might ask you about? No, I'm going to potentially ask you about all of them. So, what do you need to do?
Make sure it's on the sheet.
Make sure it's on the note. Yes, I'm sure you'll keep the note sheet with you forever. Actually, as an MBA person, shouldn't you have in your head some general rough ideas of these things?
Mhm.
Yeah. Okay. Now, let's talk about financial ratios. So we've looked at common size financial statements, and they've given us a lot of information. But not necessarily everything we need. For example, if we are going to try to look at how well we are managing our inventory, I will need to obviously look at inventory, which is on which financial statement?
Balance sheet.
Balance sheet. And then I'm going to need to compare that to the sales. Where do sales show up? Income statement. So you're never going to get any sort of measurement of inventory performance, or at least not a very good one, by looking at purely common size financial statements. By the way, I want to click back one and talk about comparisons on the common size financial statements. When I looked at, so let's compare both Americam and Poly 1 again. If I look at the percentage of debt that is represented by, or percentage of assets represented by debt, that should probably be fairly close between the two firms. But there are some things that the size is going to matter on. Remember I told you that we were buying our materials 55 pounds at a time. They were buying theirs 40,000 pounds at a time. Who do you think was paying more for a pound of plastic? We were. And so our costs of goods sold were always going to be higher as a percentage of our assets than theirs. Nothing we could do about it. So we shouldn't beat ourselves up. That also means that our net income as a percentage of our sales was going to be lower. Nothing we can do about it, so we shouldn't beat ourselves up over that. But we should make sure that's the reason that our net income is a lower percentage than theirs. Does that make sense? Okay. So, let's see. So what are these financial ratios that we're going to talk about? What can they be used for? Well, first of all, competitive analysis. The neat thing with American and Poly 1, we were privately owned. So we were the only people who had our financial statements. But Poly 1 was publicly traded. What does that mean they have to submit to the SEC every quarter?
Audited statements.
Say again?
Audited statements.
Yeah, they're audited financial statements, and so as a result, of course, those get published, and we had a chance to look at their stuff, but they couldn't look at ours. So that was nice for us to be able to do competitive analysis. And then there was the place that I saw it more, and that was internal analysis. Every month, my accountant, a guy named Jack Heffelfinger, not kidding, that's his real name, he would calculate all these ratios for my little business, and we would have a sit down and talk about them. By the way, after the first talk with Jack, I realized what was getting measured, right? By the way, do you think Jack also had the ear of my boss? It was actually my boss's accountant, right? Watching out for us mongrels in the front lines. So I knew after that what got measured. What do you think that did to how I managed the business?
Give you things to focus on.
Yeah, it gave me things to focus on. You know, in the beginning, I'm like, because I'm just an engineer, right? I have no idea what to do. I'm like when you throw a 5-year-old in a car and you give them a slushie, right? No idea and no discipline. But because I now knew what got measured, I knew what I needed to manage. Okay, so that is internal analysis. And then there is external analysis. So who's going to do external analysis? Well, first of all, there are equity analysts. And these are the people that you see putting recommendations on stocks like buy, hold, and sell. Those are the recommendations we typically see. And so these equity analysts are actually going to use these ratios to compare one company to another. And that way, let's say I am an analyst in the natural gas field, I could recommend one manufacturer or one provider of natural gas versus another, simply because I could look at their ratios and tell you which one was being operated more efficiently. And then we have suppliers. Why do you think suppliers care about our financial condition?
Because they want to know if you can pay them.
Yeah, they want to know if we can pay. Now, if we were paying cash for everything we bought, Would they care? No. Why do they care then? Yeah, they're extending credit to us. Usually in the U.S., when you buy something from another business, they give you 30, 60, 90 days to pay. They're selling to you on credit. And so if you get that and then you don't pay, that's called default, and it leads to losses at the seller. So they want to be careful about those things. So the suppliers will be looking at these things too. And then when you go down to the bank and ask for a loan, they'll be looking at these things too. Why does the bank care about your financial condition? Same reason, right? They want to get paid back. And the same is true of bond holders. By the way, if you slept through FIN 38600, bonds are another form of debt. They're just money that we've borrowed from people from the general public on fixed terms rather than from a bank. Any questions so far? Okay, now, I want you to think of these different ratios falling into families. And these families, just like the people in your family, these things are related, but they're not identical. So these things are all similar, but not identical. I have a sister and a mom and a dad. We're all similar, but we are not the same person. Even if you're an identical twin, are you the same? No. So some of these might be a little closer than others, but you need to think about them all having their own purpose. And the first one that we're going to look at are the short-term solvency or liquidity measures. What do we mean by short-term in accounting and finance? Where's the breakover point? 1 year. And solvency means basically your ability to pay bills, and so does liquidity in this meaning. There's another liquidity that we say being able to convert something into cash at or near the full market price in a short amount of time. This is when we talk about liquid assets. And so they're sort of related, but here when we talk about liquidity, we're talking about our ability to pay our debts. Now, current ratio. What do you think CA stands for, California? Current assets. And what do you think current liabilities stand for? Oh, sorry. CL is current liabilities, right? There wasn't a state name with it, so it freaked me out. Okay, so back to the story. Current assets are things that are expected to produce cash within the next year. Current liabilities are things that are expected to consume cash within the next year. Now let me ask you, what do you think is more certain? That our current assets will produce cash in the next year, or that our current liabilities will require cash in the next year? Yeah, the current liabilities, right? Because there are things in the current assets like inventory that might not sell, accounts receivable that might not get collected, right? But you can bet that people will continue to send us bills and expect us to pay them. And the same is true in life. Can you always depend on your paycheck? Hey, I can tell you, as someone who once got fired, you can, right? And so you can't always count on your paycheck, but what could I always count on from my bank or from my mortgage banker? Yeah, the bill. It shows up every month regardless, right? So current liabilities are far more likely to require cash than current assets. Now, all that said, let's assume that they're both equally likely to produce or consume cash. Which would you prefer to have? Current assets that are greater than current liabilities, or current liabilities greater than current assets? Yeah, you want to have your current assets greater than your current liabilities because that says at least you have a fighting chance to pay your bills over the coming year. And so, what kind of value would we be looking for the current ratio? Greater than 1, right? Because if current assets is greater than current liabilities, then we're looking for something greater than 1 out of the current ratio. Now, if that situation isn't working out for you, what you've got to do is go out and raise some additional money to put in the checking account without increasing the current liabilities. So, could I issue more short-term debt to get that money? Would that help?
That'll give you liabilities.
Yeah, it'll give you liability. It'll give you current liabilities, right? And so it's really not going to help the situation. So what we want to do is go out and issue long-term debt or additional shares to get additional equity. So neither one of those things are going to increase our current liabilities. The other thing we could do is go out and sell some assets. If we have some assets that we aren't using, then we could sell them and put the money in the checking account and increase our current assets. By the way, current assets, typically we're talking about, so start listing some current assets.
Inventory?
Inventory, very good. What else?
Accounts receivable.
Accounts receivable, what else? Oh, come on, what's the most
Cash,
liquid
just
of all?
cash available.
Yeah, just cash, right? And so that's what's typically involved in current assets. Okay, now let's talk about the quick ratio or asset test. Asset test, and no, for you rave people, that has nothing to do with LSD. Okay, so the asset test says, hey, wait a minute. Inventory might not sell in the next year. Inventory might not sell in the next year. And I can tell you with certainty that that is true. 1994, we were involved in getting some inventory numbers under control, and so we were going through all of our inventory. We had parts that were only useful in a bottle of pump that was only currently in use in Vietnam. And this was before trade relations got normalized between the U.S. and Vietnam. So we were not allowed to ship those parts to Vietnam. Were those parts ever going to sell? No. But year after year, from 1957 onward, they were on the books, right? And so that's one of the problems with having inventory as part of your short-term solvency or liquidity measure. And so what the quick ratio tries to do is to say, wait a minute, what would happen even if we didn't sell another piece of inventory all year long, then would we still be able to pay our bills? And so what that does, it takes current assets and subtracts the inventory before dividing by current liabilities. So something that students often get wrong here. So we said that current assets were cash plus accounts receivable plus inventory. And so all that minus inventory, what happens to the inventories? Yeah, they cancel out. And so what you'll see are solutions to problems that say cash plus AR divided by CL. And what students want to do is say that. Wrong. That's subtracting out inventory twice. Don't do that. Don't do that. I guarantee you at least one of you will do that, and then you'll email me, and I will very politely explain this thing one more time, right? Okay, so subtract out the inventory. Now, how can we interpret that? A quick ratio greater than 1 says we can pay all of our bills over the coming year even without selling a single piece of our inventory. So if this thing is greater than 1, we can pay all of our bills over the next year without even selling any of our inventory. Now, at a healthy company, are you going to sell inventory?
Yes.
Absolutely. We just know we're probably not going to sell all of the inventory, right? And so this is a little more conservative. The quick ratio is more conservative than the current ratio. Okay, now let's talk about the cash ratio. The cash ratio just takes cash and divides by current liability. So basically, it's getting rid of accounts receivable and it's getting rid of inventory. And so what does this mean? If it's greater than 1, we can pay all of our bills for the coming year without selling another piece of our inventory and without collecting any of the money owed to us by our customers. If this thing is greater than 1, it means we can pay all of our bills without collecting any of our accounts receivable and without selling any of our inventory. Now, it would be extraordinarily nuts for a company to actually have a cash ratio greater than 1. Because we know we're going to collect at least some of those sales. We know we're going to sell at least some of that inventory. By the way, is it a great idea to sit on a boatload of cash? No, Ms. Wabi, why not?
It's a waste.
It's a waste. You're exactly right. How?
Because you could be
Yeah, you could be putting it to a higher use, right? And by the way, who does the cash belong to? The shareholders. And so the shareholders could just put that in their savings account just like you can at the company, right? And so that's not what the shareholders are paying you to do. And if you don't have a good idea of how to put it back into the company, what should you be doing with the cash?
Dividends.
Giving it back to dividends and share repurchases. Give that money back to the shareholders. It was theirs to begin with anyway. Does that make sense? Okay. Sometimes we see companies carrying too much cash, especially if they are still managed by their original founders. Any idea why? Any idea why original founders? Let's talk about Steve Jobs. Did Steve Jobs come from a wealthy family? No. In fact, Steve Jobs was adopted by two great working class people with a modest house and a one-car garage where they started Apple, right? Now, do you think the first time that Steve Jobs took his first prototype Apple computer to the bank and showed it to them, they're like, oh yeah, that's going to be huge. How much money do you want? No. They said, boy, that looks like an orange crate with a bunch of wires in it. What does it do? Right? And then they told him to get lost. And so it's really hard when you're starting up a business to get your hands on capital. And so founders often carry that with them the rest of their lives. So as long as the founder is still in charge of the company, you will still see them carrying way too much money. Apple was an example. Microsoft was an example. Still, they're sitting on too much cash at the time. Now, what happens when a professional manager takes over? Well, professional managers have always worked for big organizations. They've never had trouble raising capital. What do you think happens to cash levels at the company?
Decrease.
Yeah, they're going to decrease. That's human behavior. So, who cares about these measures? Well, suppliers. Why should suppliers care about your ability to meet your short-term obligations? They want their money, and you owe them money on a 30, 60, 90-day term. All of that is within the next year. And of course, any other short-term creditors. Banks may loan you money on the short term in order for you to go out and buy inventory. There are other short-term creditors that we could talk about, but those people are always going to be interested in these short-term measures. Do you think those people give a hoot about your long-term solvency? Now, as long as the short-term is in good shape, they're going to keep loaning you money, but they're going to keep keeping an eye on those short-term measures. And as soon as those go south, what do? Take it.
Pull out.
Yeah, they pull out. I'll give you an example. So back in the day, there was Bed Bath & Beyond and a company called Linens and Things. And I'm guessing the things were the same stuff as the Beyond from Bed Bath & Beyond. Now, Bed Bath & Beyond, which is gasping for breath as I speak, they were at the time the strong one. Linens and Things, their short-term solvency measures started to get low. What do you think their suppliers did? I said, yeah, that's fine. Don't worry about it. Just go ahead and send us cash. Now, if their short-term liquidity measures are already low, do you think they have cash? No. So what do? They go to the bank. They're like, hey, can you loan us some money? And the bank looks at their long-term solvency stuff and says, no, pal, you've had enough, right? Some of you have been told that before, but not at the bank, right? Okay, so what do you think happened at Linens and Things? By the way, Linens and Things didn't have the cash to send to the suppliers, so what happened to their inventory on the shelves? Yeah, the good stuff sold out. They couldn't replenish it. What's left on the shelves?
Nothing.
The cream of the crop, right? It's the bad stuff. And so, how do you think the story ends for Linens and Things? Yeah, bankruptcy. They're gone, right? And there may be some Chinese company that bought the name Linens and Things and is selling Chinese-made linens and things on the web, but you can't walk into a store anymore. Questions? Okay. Now, let's talk about long-term solvency measures. Long-term solvency measures, we're looking at more than a year. And in this case, we have two subfamilies within this. And so the first set, you could think of these as brothers and sisters. leverage measures, and then there are some brothers and sisters within these interest coverage measures, and we can consider these things to be cousins between the two groups. Now, leverage, what does that refer to? Any idea? Yeah, the amount of leverage that you're using is the amount of debt in your capital structure. And we'll talk about why it's leverage here in a little bit. My favorite measure of leverage is the total debt ratio, sometimes just referred to as the debt ratio. So it's a total debt divided by total assets. Now, why would I tell you instead to use total assets minus total equity over total assets? The answer is sometimes students just use long-term debt over total assets, but that would be wrong because it ignores what kinds of liabilities? Yeah, the current liabilities, it ignores them. And so that total assets minus total equity divided by total assets is a way to force you to remember to include the current liabilities. And after all, we know that assets is equal to debt plus equity, so it totally makes sense. Then we have the debt to equity ratio. I personally despise this measure. And here's why I despise this measure. If you have changes in the capital structure, it leads to these nonlinear changes in this measure. For example, if the total debt ratio goes from 50% to 60%, 0.5 to 0.6, that's really only a 20% increase in that measure. But what happens to your debt to equity ratio? Well, it was 1 to 1, and now we're looking at what? 3 over 2. So the debt to equity ratio went from 1.5. So, it went from 1 to 1.5. So it had a 50% increase when the capital structure really only changed, say, 20%. So I hate this number. Why do I teach it to you? Number one, it's used widely for whatever reason. You'll hear analysts on CNBC, and they'll be throwing it around, oh yeah, debt to equity, and you need to know what it means, right? The other thing is really easy to calculate, and we're going to find it useful for the next thing. The next thing is the equity multiplier, and it's just total assets over total equity. But here's something really cool about that. We know that total assets is equal to total equity plus total debt. Can we all agree on that? Okay, now, if I divide all of these things by TE, which is exactly what's going on here with the equity multiplier, what happens to this term? Yeah, it's just 1, right? And so what we see is that the equity multiplier is just 1 plus the debt to equity ratio. The equity multiplier is just 1 plus the debt to equity ratio. And in fact, you may find yourself on an exam and you know you need the equity multiplier to solve this problem, but you don't have it. And what you're going to say is, that bastard, he didn't give me enough to solve the problem. And as soon as those words cross your mind, I want you to think, did he give me the debt to equity ratio? Because if I did, then all you have to do is add 1, and you've got the equity multiplier. By the way, do you think the kind of questions that allow you to get an A in this class on the exam only require 1 step? No. A good A question is going to have at least 3 steps. A good B question is going to have 2 steps. C question, I just want my MBA, that's going to have perhaps 1 step, right? So, yeah, get used to the idea that you're going to have to solve more than 1 thing per problem. Any questions?
I just want to make sure I have that right. The equity multiplier is equal to 1 plus the debt to equity ratio.
Yep, that's correct. Other questions? Okay, so who's going to care about these things? Well, long-term creditors. And let's talk about each of these in turn. First of all, leverage measures all talk about how much debt you already have in your capital structure. Let's take this down to a real simple situation for you. You have 2 friends that are otherwise identical. They have the same job, they have the same income, but the difference between these 2 friends is one of them has a boatload of debt and the other one is debt-free. They both tell you, I'd like to borrow $50. To whom do you loan the money?
The one with no debt.
Yeah, the one with no debt. And the reason is, why?
Credit risk.
Yeah, the one that has a lot of debt is a bigger credit risk. Remember, debt is a fixed claim. There's all these payments they have to make every month. If there's the slightest hiccup in their income, let's say that they're a server at Buffalo Wild Wings, and they have a bad week, and the tips are rotten. And by the way, their other debt is to the credit card company and the bank. Who are they going to stiff? You or the bank? Right, you. And so what happens here is that banks are the same way. They want to make sure that these companies have the ability to pay them back, and that a slight hiccup in the firm's cash inflows isn't going to cause them to miss their payment. And so, of course, they would prefer that all of these leverage measures be lower. Let me repeat that. Long-term creditors would prefer for all these leverage measures to be lower. So, lower leverage measures are more appealing to creditors. Those are the people that loan us money. Now, they would prefer that we had no debt at all, but that's not optimal. We know that debt has a tax benefit. Interest is tax deductible, and so it actually lowers our pre-tax income, and that lowers our taxes, and that increases our profit. And so there is a beautiful amount of debt that we would like to have. So you got to balance out here. These creditors are asking me basically to be debt-free, and on the other hand, I know that there's a certain amount of debt that I should be holding. So just because your banker would like for you to be debt-free otherwise doesn't mean that you should be. But that's the direction they want you to be going. They want lower rather than higher. The interest coverage measures are about the company's ability to pay interest over the coming year. Now, let's talk about why firms would, or banks, lenders, would be interested in the ability to pay interest. When you pay back your car loan or your home loan, every payment represents actually two things. What are they? Interest and principal. Principal is paying that money back. But it turns out that a lot of the money that companies borrow doesn't get any sort of principal over the life of it. The principal's all paid back at the end. So as long as the company can make the interest payments, then things are probably okay. Does that make sense? Now, at the end, that huge amount of principal that they owe, do you think they have a bunch of money just laying around that they're going to use to pay that off? How do you think they pay it off?
Loan from other place.
Yeah, they go out and issue new debt. They either sell new bonds or they borrow new money from the bank. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
This is how the United States stays in business, folks. As those 30-year bonds mature, do you think Joe Biden's sitting on a big stack of savings, cash that he's kept, and he's just, no. We're borrowing new money. So let's talk about these interest coverage measures. The first one is the times interest earned, or TIE. That's how you remember that, times interest earned. And it is EBIT over interest. I'm going to ask Mr. Sadai, what does EBIT stand for?
Earning before interest and taxes.
Yeah, it's earnings before interest and taxes. Now, if that thing's greater than 1, I should be able to pay my interest over the coming year. And you say, wait a minute. I see that it's earnings before interest, so that makes sense. But you got to pay your taxes, except for one thing. We know that interest is tax deductible, right? And so if this thing is exactly 1, how much are you going to be paying in taxes? 0, right? The tax on 0 is 0. That's one of the things they should have told you in accounting. The tax on 0 is 0. Okay. Now, you might say, wait a minute. EBIT already has depreciation subtracted out of it. Do you see that? Maybe you don't. Earnings before interest, just take my word for it. Earnings before interest and taxes already has depreciation subtracted out. Depreciation is a non-cash expense. And so we actually have more cash on hand than EBIT would say that we do. And so a less conservative measure would be the cash coverage ratio, which is where we add back that depreciation to EBIT. After all, we didn't pay cash for that expense. So EBIT is short by that amount if we're using it as a measure of cash. Now, notice that this has a very similar name to something else we've already talked about today. We talked about the cash ratio, and now we're talking about the cash coverage ratio. Those are two different things, so please don't get confused.
So non-cash expenses,
Mhm.
depreciation is one of the main ones.
Yep.
And then deferred taxes.
Yep.
Are there any other ones that we
Those are the big ones.
need? So those are the only ones like we need
Yeah.
to think about.
Well, for this class.
Right.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Keep in mind, I'm not an accountant, and so I'm not going to be throwing a bunch of weird picayune stuff at you, right? Picayune means small or trivial. So I'm not going to be throwing that at you.
I had to look that up on the homework because I wasn't sure.
You had to
Me
look
too.
up.
Last question. On the last question
Uh-huh.
was over that, and I had to look it up on the homework because I wasn't sure if anything else
Yes.
was on that.
Very good. You're what we call an autodidact. You taught yourself something new. It's beautiful. In fact, most students in online classes feel that they must be autodidact because a lot of times they end up having to teach themselves. I hope my online class is not like that. Questions? Yes?
So what is the difference between current cash ratio and cash conversion ratio?
Okay, so the cash ratio, we said was just cash divided by current liabilities, right? And it's a short-term solvency measure. And so that's in the short-term family. Here we're looking at the long-term stuff. And I know it kind of messes with your head because we're talking about a year's worth of EBIT and a year's worth of interest, so it sounds short-term. But the reason it's actually long-term is because these companies don't end up paying the principal until maybe 10, 15, 30 years down the line. So in the meantime, their ability to meet their interest on their current obligations is what we're interested in. So it's actually a long-term measure. And it's EBIT plus depreciation. We're adding that depreciation back to look at how much cash we have coming in on an annual basis that is available to pay those interest on those debts. Does that make sense? Very good. Okay. Any questions? Okay. Now let's talk about asset management or turnover measures. And the first one we're going to talk about here is inventory turns. By the way, what does COGS stand for? Cost of goods sold, and we're going to divide by inventory. Now, I want you to notice, if you look on down with receivables turnover, we're actually using sales as our measure of sales and dividing by accounts receivable. Both of these things are measures of sales. The question is, why are we using cost of goods sold and inventory turnover instead of total sales? Any idea?
You're charging different amounts.
Yeah, so inventory is recorded at cost. Cost of goods sold is recorded, you might guess from the name, at cost. And so it's an apples to apples measurement here. Now, sometimes you will get into a strategy class and they will do sales divided by inventory. That's just not right. That is not right at all. It's going to be inflated because the sales are at your retail numbers and are at your price, and your inventory is at cost. So you don't want to do that. So what does that number represent? How many times on average do I sell my inventory over the course of a year? By the way, cost of goods sold is in terms of per year, or whatever we're looking at, it's in those terms. So in usually per year. So let's just say per year. Cost of goods sold divided by inventory. Now, if it gets fancy, you may hear average inventory. So how would I find the average inventory? It's really difficult. Beginning inventory plus ending inventory divided by 2. There you go. You didn't even have to get the calculator out for that one, right? Okay, so we're just going to add those, divide by 2, and it's all good. Now, what does that tell us? How many times per year, on average, does our inventory sell? Does that mean every single thing on the shelf sells that many times per year? No. Some of them will be moving very quickly, and some of them may take actually more than a year to sell. And so the turn on that item would actually be less than 1. Okay, now let's assume that our inventory turns are 12. That means on average our items are staying on the shelf for how long? A month. Okay, so we can actually put that into some a formula here. The days sales in inventory is equal to 365 divided by the inventory turns that we just calculated. Where does 365 come from? Days in a year, right? Now, some of you say, wait a minute, what if it's a leap year? We don't worry about that. There's actually 365 and a quarter days in a year. We're not worried about that. Don't worry about it. Okay. Divide by inventory turns. Now, we know if we have 365 over turns, and turns is actually cost of goods divided by inventory, then this thing is actually just inventory divided by cost of goods sold. So I could do that instead of dividing by turns, because multiplying by the inverse is the same as dividing. If you can't remember that, go back and look at the algebra review, please. Okay, so you could do this, or you could just go ahead and calculate the turns first and then plug it in. Either way, I don't care. Okay, any questions so far on inventory turns? By the way, let's take our example here. 365 divided by 12 is what? Roughly?
30.
Yeah, it's 30 to 31, right? And how many days are in a month?
30 to 30.
30 to 30, yeah, typically, right? And so this makes total sense that if you had inventory turns of 12, they'd be on the shelf for 30 days. Now, let's ask this question. What would you prefer? Would you prefer higher inventory turnover or lower inventory turnover? Yeah, you always want higher, because every time I sell those items, I'm getting profit, right? And your inventory is an investment. Keeping inventory on the shelf costs money because I have to spend money to put it there to begin with. And I also have to have a warehouse. I have to make sure that people don't steal this stuff. I have to make sure it doesn't expire or go bad. By the way, more than just food expires. I used to work in the oil field industry, and we had things called elastomers, which you might call rubber stuff. And those things would go on the shelf and go bad. Did you know that tires have an expiration date on them?
Yeah.
Yeah, they're only good for like 5 years. Did you know that? My dad bought some fancy new wheels for his pickup truck like in 1999. And he kept his old tires out in the barn. And then recently he got a flat tire. So you know what he did? He got those old tires out. And I'm like, Dad, that's nuts. I said, look, they've got an expiration date on them. They're only good for 5 years from the day of the manufacture, and that is long gone, right? It's like, right? Because you can't convince 81-year-old people of anything. Okay, back to the story. Things can go bad on the shelf. So we would prefer to keep our inventory lower, which would give us a higher cost, or a higher inventory turns, because we're going to keep our cost of goods sold the same. Okay, now, students often want to say, well, there's actually 2 ways to make inventory turns greater. We can lower inventory, or we can increase the cost of goods sold by increasing our sales. Let's talk about how easy it is to manage your sales versus your inventory. Anybody here involved in sales? Do you have 100% luck with your sales?
No.
What do you sell?
Well, mortgages, basically.
Okay. And so you shoot them a rate, right? And what percentage of them do you think actually end up going with your company?
Out of the people I call, probably like 5%.
5%! Now, let's talk about industrial sales. The first time you go out to meet an industrial sales customer, do you think they're like, oh yeah, your stuff's great. You're a great guy. I'm going to buy your stuff. No. It was funny. I used to be a salesman. Didn't talk too much about it to my mom. My sister then got into sales long after I got out, and she had just made her first tour of her customers. And my mom says, "Did you sell anything?" And my sister and I busted out laughing. I said, "Mom, it's not like hunting. It's like gardening, right? You got to go out. You got to prepare the soil. You got to fertilize. You got to plant the seed. You got to water, right? And maybe something grows." Now, with that in mind, what's it easier to do? Increase your cost of goods sold or reduce your inventory? Yeah, it's easier to reduce your inventory. And let's talk about how you go about doing that. You can think of your inventory as being a tank full of water. And you've got water coming out, and you've got water coming in. In order to keep the inventory at the same level, what must be true of the amount coming out and the amount going in? They got to be the same, right? So if you want this thing to go down, there's only two ways to do it. You can either reduce the amount that's coming into it, or you can increase the amount that's coming out. How does stuff come out of inventory? Oh, okay, so let's just say sales. Let's just say sales. And I just got through telling you that increasing sales a great amount in a short term is not easy without discounts, right? And that's got to hurt our profitability. So, what's easier is to slow down the stuff that's going into inventory. And there are two ways things get into inventory. Either we buy it from someone else, or we make it. We either buy it or we make it. If you're in retail, of course, you're buying everything. If you're in manufacturing, you're doing a mix of those things because you're buying raw material. Sometimes you're buying complete assemblies, right? But you're also making a lot of stuff. Now, what you need to do if you're going to reduce this inventory, which is what I'm going to tell you you've got to do, right? The first thing I would do is look at what is in my inventory that I have too much of. And if it's stuff that I've bought, there's a real simple solution. Stop buying that stuff, right? Stop buying that stuff and let your sales then start to reduce that inventory, that excess inventory. That's the easy thing, is to be able to stop buying stuff. Stop making stuff is a little more difficult. Any ideas why?
Then you have fixed assets that are just sitting there doing nothing.
Oh yeah, I've got fixed assets that are sitting there doing nothing, but more importantly, I've got laborers. Now, you might say, whew, we'll just shut the plant down for a month and lay everybody off. Who comes back at the end of the month?
Nobody.
Oh, no. You'll get some knuckle draggers, mouth breathers, cream of the crap. They'll all be back because, after all, they spent the whole time off sleeping on their mom's couch, right? Your good workers, your hard chargers, where are they going to be? Yeah, they found a new job. And so this happened to us in 1994, Duncan, Oklahoma. We have figured out that we had too much in our inventory that was stuff that we had made. And so the only solution was to shut down the plant. But we had the long, dark night of the soul where we said, we can't lay these guys off. And so what did we do? Well, the first week, we had a cleaning party. And everybody, and including me, management, engineering, doesn't matter, everybody, it was all hands on deck, and we were out there, and we had that place scrubbed absolutely clean. You could eat off the floor, though I would not. You could have, right? We got it clean. At the end of the week, we took a snapshot of our inventory, and we said, still too high. Week 2, we paint. We allow them to paint, or actually we make them paint, but we allow them to choose the color for their machine. By the way, big mistake. Have you ever seen those neighborhoods down along the Gulf Coast? They've got all those pastel colors, and that's what our shop looked like. Looked like a bunch of hippies worked there. Anyway, not there's anything wrong with hippies. Anyway, so that was week 2. And then we take a snapshot of our inventory, and at the end of week 2, we still have too much. heck, the place is already clean and is painted within an inch of its life. I mean, short of having the guys start painting murals on the walls, not much we could do. But the good news is, it is Oklahoma, where land is cheap, and so we had lots of area around the plant that had not been properly tended to from a landscaping perspective. And so we bought a bunch of these, have you seen these weed hook things? It's like a blade on the end of a stick. Yeah, pretty cheap, like 12 bucks. And we launched an army of manufacturing workers out into the weeds. By the way, I took vacation that week. Not proud of it, but there you go. So, and they actually went out there and chopped weeds. And by the way, this is July in southern Oklahoma. Hotter than hell. Now, I have never seen a group of people, by the way, at the end of the third week, we take the snapshot. Phew, we are finally where we need to be. And we say to everybody on Friday afternoon, come back to work on Monday, we'll be back in the shop. I have never seen a group of people more thrilled to report to work in an air-conditioned factory in all my life, right? It had to be air-conditioned, people would have died in there. Okay, so that's my inventory management advice. Don't try to increase your sales. You're not going to be able to do it in the short term. You've got to do it by reducing your inventory. You can't do it by increasing sales. We just discussed that. You've got to look at whether it was stuff that you bought or stuff that you made, and then you've got to cut back on one or the other of those. But unless it's a long-term problem, don't lay off your workers. Questions? Okay, now let's talk about receivables turnover. How do we get receivables? What do they represent?
Sales on credit.
Yeah, sales on credit. In fact, that top, the numerator should say credit sales. The numerator should say credit sales. And unless I tell you otherwise, though, in an exam, you are to assume that all sales are on credit. And that's basically true for the great majority of American businesses that sell to other businesses. All the sales are on credit. So credit sales does equal sales in most cases, but unless I say otherwise, just assume that the sales are all on credit. Now, sales, we've got here, we said it was at what we sell at, the price we sell at, and so is accounts receivable. So once again, these things match up. And this thing is a measure of, by the way, inventory turns is a measure of how well am I using my inventory to produce sales. This is a measure of how well am I using my accounts receivable to produce sales. And so just like with inventory turns, don't do that to me. Just like with inventory turns, we would prefer this turns measure to be higher. Does that make sense? And so let's talk about what would we even like to be able to get away totally from having accounts receivable? Do you like lending money to your friends, your deadbeat friends, who don't pay interest? No. Accounts receivable is a no-interest loan that we're making to someone else. Does that make sense? And so I prefer not to have that at all. Why do we do it? Why do we offer credit? Yeah, to increase sales. Now, if you are in a market where none of your competitors offer credit, do you need to offer credit? No. But if you want more sales in that market, what do you have to do? You can offer credit. And then, what do your competitors all have to do?
Offer.
Yeah, they have to offer credit too. So in the end, you're all back to where you started, only you're worse off because now you've all offered credit. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, so we would prefer accounts receivable to be smaller if at all possible. So we like this receivables turnover to be higher. And we know if we want to increase those turns, that increasing sales is not the answer. By the way, just write that down. Increasing sales is never the answer, at least in the short term. Increasing sales is never the answer. Increasing sales is never the answer, at least in the short term, because it takes time to grow those relationships. So instead, what are we going to do? We're going to try to get our accounts receivable down. How do you think we're going to do that?
Offering less credit.
Okay, we could offer less credit, but if we offer less credit, what's that going to do to our sales? Yeah, it's going to go down. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at those accounts receivable and start looking for people who are past due. What does past due mean?
Not paid.
Yeah, they're late to pay. Remember, we're telling them you've got 30, 60, 90 days, something like that. If they haven't paid during that time, then we need to have a talk with them, and we may end up having to cut them off, right? I was doing some pro bono consulting. What's pro bono mean? Free. Done some free consulting with this local firm, and this was during the financial crisis. And I noticed that their days sales and receivables was going up, up, up. That means that their turns were going down, down, down. And I looked at it, their chart that they had of this, for like 2 seconds. And I turned around and I said, let me guess, you consider your customers to be your friends. They said, yeah, how do you know? I said, because your friends are taking advantage of your relationship to get this interest-free loan from you. Oh man, times are hard. Can't we just, and you go like, oh, okay, right? I said, well, I don't need more friends. I've got enough friends. What I need are paying customers, which I thought was kind of ironic given that I was doing pro bono consulting, right? Okay, they're like, okay. So how, let me tell you a good story, and it's a true story. You know, some of my stories aren't, but this one is. So I'm at my folks for this Christmas party, and you know, my folks are just all to the earth people. I don't know how they know this guy, but he's the former CFO for a company that is now a Fortune 500 company. But when he was with him to begin with, it was just a small growing concern. And their primary raw material for their operation was steel. And so his primary suppliers were these steel suppliers. And in the early days of the company, he said, I would get these bills in, and it would say, you owe us $1,200, and he would type out, by the way, no computers, right? He types out the check, $1,200, he puts it in the envelope, and he sticks it in his drawer. When do you think he pulls it out and mails it?
89 days.
Okay, so if they're giving us 90 days, the typical student answer would be 89 days, and that would be I think is the correct answer, right? What you should do ethically. But when do you think he actually pulled it out and mailed it?
He has ADHD, probably never.
Say again?
He has ADHD, probably
Oh,
never.
okay. So let's stipulate that this person is not. That this person is neurotypical, right? This person is. Let's use the
It's out of
word.
mind, out of sight.
Let's use the word normal for lack of a better term, right? So let's assume that they don't have any of these impairments. What do you think?
When they call for it?
Yeah, when they called. When they called. So here's how that conversation would go. Hey Frank, this is Robert from Central Steel. I couldn't help but notice we haven't received your check yet. Could you check to see if that might have gotten lost in your system? Now what's the person really saying?
It is.
You're late, schmuck, right? Okay, so, and Frank would open up his drawer and look in, and he's like, don't worry about it, check's in the mail. And he would sort out that check, he would take it, and he would drop it in the mail. He said, I did that for 5 years, and only one supplier ever figured it out. He said on day 29, I would get a call from Jim, and Jim would say, hey Frank, time to mail the check. One time, one guy, right? Now, am I telling you that that's the way that you should be? No. And here's the really ironic thing. I'm telling this story in this very classroom, and I have this student sitting right here. And this student actually worked for the same company. Now, I still haven't told you the name of the company, right? This student worked for the same company, and she said, phew, I wish my company was like that. We always just pay stuff when it comes in. What had changed? Back when Frank was running the finance, there were like 5 people and no money. Now it's a Fortune 500 company, and it's the agency problem. These people don't care. They're just like, oh, I'll probably forget if we don't pay it now, so they just go ahead and pay it. Which is, by the way, how I pay my bills. Questions? Okay. So that's how you manage receivables, is you pick up the phone and call them. College buddy of mine, his dad owned a fuel distributorship. sold gasoline to these independent stations throughout northern Arkansas. And he would always go, and they would always have some sad story, and he would always come home and tell his wife these sad stories that these customers had told him to keep from paying their bills. His wife was trying to raise 6 kids on the money that he brought home. Who do you think was incentivized to collect those debts? And so the really tough debts, he didn't even try to go collect himself. He always just sent the wife. She never failed. So there's a lesson to you. Send your wife. She got her eyes on the money. Okay.
My husband can tell you how much we pay anything.
What's that?
My husband can tell you how much we pay anything.
There you go. There's your sound financial thinker. Okay. Now, let's see. What else we got here? And we can do the same thing with days sales and receivable that we did with inventory turns. If I've got 12 turns in my accounts receivable, it means that people are paying in roughly 30 days. What if I tell you that the day sales and receivable is 59 days? Is that good or bad? How do we know? Unless I tell you the terms that we're giving to our customers, you can't tell me whether that's good or bad. If I tell you we're asking people to pay in 60 days and our day sales and receivable is 59, we're doing great. If we're telling our customers to pay in 30 days and they're paying in 59 days, we stink. Now, students, when I say, how are we going to solve this problem? Sometimes they're like, let's just give them more time to pay. Why is that a bad idea? If they're taking 59 days now to pay when I tell them 30, if I give them 60, what are they going to do? They're going to take even longer, right? 89 days? Maybe they'll even double it. Who knows, right? Does that make sense? I had this guy that worked for me. His name was Ramon. And the first week, Ramon's start time was at 3 o'clock. He shows up at 3:15. I said, Ramon, your start time is 3:15 or 3 o'clock. He says, I've got these kids, and my wife doesn't drive, and I got to pick these kids up, and da-da-da-da. I'm like, okay. I'm trying to be the open-minded, young, idealistic boss, right? So what do? I say, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to shorten your lunch hour to 45 minutes, and your new start time is 3:15. How's that? He's like, oh, thank you. Okay. What time do you think he came in the next day? 3:30, son of a... Right? Yeah, I ended up having to fire him. Okay. So let's talk about total asset turnover. We're looking at sales divided by total assets. And the way you can think about this is, how well am I using my assets to produce sales? So I'm going to give you an example of 2 different car companies here, Hyundai and Stellantis. What is Stellantis? It sounds like an antacid, right? But it's actually the combination of Fiat, Chrysler, and some other crap car companies. Now, and my apologies to those of you who are driving Chrysler products at this point. I once bought one myself, and that's why I don't buy them anymore. Back to the story. If Hyundai wants to sell more cars, they basically have to build new factories because their factories are running at 100%. Their total asset turnover looks pretty good. Stellantis, on the other hand, they're probably running around 60% capacity. And so what should they be doing? Can they increase their sales in the short term? No. So what do? They need to consolidate their manufacturing into fewer facilities and then sell off those now vacant factories to try to get their assets down. So that's how I'm going to raise that total asset turnover. Not by increasing sales, but by reducing assets. And which assets do I sell? The ones that I'm not using. Questions? Okay, we will start next time talking about profitability measures. All right, let's get going here. So last time we talked about short-term solvency, long-term solvency measures. What's the difference between short-term and long-term? Yeah, time. So what's the breakover point? Yeah, 1 year. And so short-term measures, suppliers are going to be interested in that. Anyone loaning you money on the short term. Who's interested in your long-term solvency? Say again? Who does that look?
Like banks, people on.
Yeah. banks, bondholders, people are loaning you money on a longer term. So those are who are going to be interested in the long-term solvency measures. And then we talked about the asset management measures. And I don't think we got quite to who cares about those. But for one of them was internal analysis. And that's where we would look at our own performance. And that's where I used to see these all the time. When I was running a business, my accountant would produce those, and then we'd have long talks about how I was falling short, right? And then you'll have external analysis would be like you'd have competitors looking at it. You would also have equity analysts that might be looking at those sorts of things. In fact, you'll hear people, in fact, just in the last few weeks, we hear a lot about inventory at retail. Inventory turnover is down. Does anyone know why?
Supply chain.
The supply chain, very good. So the supply chain stunk. And during the COVID thing, everybody wanted to buy certain things. And the supply chain, it's like ships stacked up out in the ocean just waiting to dock. And so what does everyone do? They order way more than they need. And guess what? Suddenly all the ships dock, all that crap shows up at the store, and you guys are done buying exercise equipment and webcams and all that stuff, and now they've got it coming out their ears. And so there's a couple ways that they're getting rid of that. Number one, discounts at their own stores. What's the downside for that? Yeah, it cuts profitability. Number two, selling that stuff to liquidators. Same downside, right? And also, if you continue to sell these goods and you liquidated part of them, people can go out to Overstocks and buy it for 20. Why are they going to buy it from you for 40? Does that make sense? Okay, so those are the kinds of things that we see equity analysts looking at. Okay, now let's talk about profitability measures. And the first one we're going to talk about is profit margin, and that is NI. What does NI stand for? Yeah, it's net income divided by sales. And you can think of this as the number of cents that you make in profit for every dollar of sales. Now, there are two ways that you can raise your profit margin here. We can either make net income larger, or we could make sales smaller. Which would you recommend? By the way, what's good? Higher profit margin or lower? Yeah, we tend to say higher is better, right? So, do I want to cut my sales? No. Now, we recently saw the automakers have to do this because they only had so many chips, semiconductors, that they could put in cars. And so what did they do? Do you think they kept cranking out the cheap cars? No. So the profit margin is much better on SUVs and luxury cars, and so automakers would focus on putting the chips into those cars as opposed to these low-end ones. In that case, they were able to improve the profit margin. But if they had had an unlimited supply of chips, they would have gone ahead and made all those cars and thus had greater sales and perhaps a slightly lower profit margin. Now, so decreasing sales is not the answer, so increasing net income has to be. Now, what is net income? It starts at the very top with your sales, and so that's the price times the number of units. And then we're subtracting out costs. So what should we be doing? We could increase the price, right? All else equal, that would increase our net income. What's the problem?
People won't buy it at a higher price.
Yeah, people will buy it at a higher price. And so the number that you sell goes down, and you could hurt yourself. Now, there may be a point at which it's good to raise your price a little bit, and it lowers the units by a little bit, and you actually end up making more money there. So there is an optimum. But typically, we're just not going to try to crank up the price to increase our profit margin. So what does that leave for us? If we can't crank up the price, what do we have to do?
Decrease cost.
Yeah, you got to decrease costs. Now, we've talked previously about the kinds of costs that we want to get rid of. And the kind that we want to get rid of is the non-value added costs. So we talked about Hershey's getting rid of the cocoa butter was a mistake. And substituting horse meat for beef was a mistake, right? But there are some costs that we can get rid of that our customers don't care about. I'll give an example. Anybody here ever changed the spark plugs in their car? You have a husband for that sort of thing? Yeah, good for you. You have? Okay. When you bought the spark plugs, did they come in a big box, like big package that contained all the spark plugs? Yeah. How many cylinders in your engine? 8. Woo! She's a V8 gal. Okay. Straight into very rare, right? Okay, so she gets 8 spark plugs and they're in this big package. Now, once you opened up that package, what happened with each individual spark plug?
They just fell out.
Oh, they just fell out, okay. Well, so good spark plugs are packaged individually. In fact, one time my dad used one of those little individual spark plug boxes to make a splint for my cat that broke its leg. Kind of fun. Not the breaking of the leg, the splint. So, my point is that there is all this packaging. Now, you may feel special when you're undoing all this packaging as a person changing your own spark plugs. But if you were building tons and tons of cars, would all that packaging bring you extra value? No, in fact, it's going to bring you the opposite of extra value. So what could you do? You could come up with some sort of reusable packaging, like a tray that the spark plug sat in, that would be easy for the assembly workers to pull out and put in. And so those are the kinds of non-value added things that we want to get rid of to bring down our costs. Always good to get rid of those kinds of costs. And so that's how I would tell you to bring up your profit margin, is to get rid of costs that don't bring value to your customer. Now, what about your EBITDA margin? Anyone know what EBITDA means?
Earnings before interest, taxes, amortization, and depreciation.
Oh, very good. He's on fire. Okay, so now let's talk about pronunciation here. If I say EBITDA, someone undoubtedly corrects me and says it's pronounced how? Oh, EBITDA. If I say EBIT, they say EBIT. And if I say EBIT, they say EBIT. Right? Whatever. Whatever floats your boat, right? Just find out how your boss pronounces it and follow suit. Okay. Now, what does that mean? Earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. And so if we think of the firm, what might differentiate what might differentiate firms other than their operations? Well, how about the amount of debt that they have? You could have two identical firms finance in different ways. One that was 100% equity would have no interest payments whatsoever, and one that was 50% debt funded would have lots of interest payments. So that's the first difference. Don't worry about taxes, but let's talk about depreciation and amortization. By the way, amortization is very similar to depreciation. It's just for forest, oil wells, mines, that sort of stuff. But both of those things are non-cash expenses, and they both have to do with the age of your assets. When I got my first business that I was running in 1997, every single one of my machines was fully depreciated out. And so I had no depreciation expense whatsoever. But the operation right next to me had some brand new machines, so they had depreciation. If we were looking purely at net income, I would have looked better simply because I didn't have the depreciation to subtract out to bring down my net income. Does that make sense? And so if I want to look at how the operations are truly performing, I'm going to look at this EBITDA margin. It gives us a better idea of how good your operations are performing, stripped out with all the age of your assets and your capital structure. By the way, what do we say capital structure is? What was the definition of capital structure?
How we fund the business, how much flow, how much cash.
Yeah, so how we fund the business, how much debt and how much equity, right? Proportions of debt and equity in our capital structure. Okay, so that's just like profit margin, only on an operational level. So it's sort of an operational profit margin. And then we have return on assets, which is pretty easy. It's just net income divided by total assets. You can think of this as how we are using the assets of the firm to produce profit. And what do you think would be better there, higher or lower?
Higher.
Yeah, generally higher we're looking for. Now, we said that the goal of financial management is to do what? Yeah, maximize shareholder wealth. And so it's nice to know what we're doing with our assets, but what we might be more concerned about is the return on equity, which is the money invested by those very shareholders. And so what we're going to do is take net income and divide it by total equity. Now, knowing that total assets is equal to total debt plus total equity, if the firm has any debt whatsoever, what's going to be true about the relationship between ROE and ROA? Let's ask this question. What if the firm has no debt whatsoever? What's the relationship between those two? Yeah, they're going to be the same, right? If there's no debt whatsoever, they're going to be the same. But as we start to add debt, you're going to see ROE pull away from ROA. And so you start to get this warm feeling that perhaps you could just take on a boatload of debt, blow that ROE up. And we'll talk about why that's not necessarily a great idea. So who cares about these things? Well, we use them for internal measures for one. And then, of course, the equity analysts and your competitors are going to be looking at these things. By the way, remember my example about Americhem and Poly 1. Do you think that our profit margin was ever going to be as high as theirs? No, our cost of goods sold was higher because we bought such lower quantities that we paid more for each pound of raw material. And so even though we knew we could never hit their profit margin, if we were only at 1/3 or 1/2 of their profit margin, maybe we should start looking at what we're doing wrong. Okay, questions? Now let's talk about market value measures. And the first one is earnings per share. And anytime you hear accountants talk about earnings, they are talking about net income. Anytime you hear accountants talk about earnings, they are talking about net income. And so all we're going to do here is take net income divided by shares outstanding. Where am I going to find the net income for the firm? Which financial statement? Yeah, the income statement, right? That was just way too easy. Where are we going to find the shares outstanding for the firm? Say again? Yeah, sometimes it's a note on the balance sheet down at the bottom, footnote. It's always going to be mentioned somewhere in the annual report. And you could also go to Yahoo Finance or Google Finance, if there is such a thing. You can look it up online, right? So that's where you get that number. Now, the next question is this. What's better, higher EPS or lower EPS?
Higher.
It depends. Let's talk about this. I have two identical firms. One has 10,000 shares outstanding and one has 100,000 shares outstanding. The firm with 10,000 shares outstanding has an EPS that's 10 times higher. Is that necessarily better? No, it's just like cutting the pizza in more slices, right? And so your instinct is correct if we are looking at the same company over time, assuming they keep the same number of shares. Does that make sense? Because that just means net income's going up. But we cannot use this, if I just say EPS is $1.36, the only thing you can tell me from that is that the net income at the firm is positive. That's the only thing you can tell me because you don't know how many shares are outstanding. When does EPS become important? Well, it has to do with these equity analysts and with reporting. So once every quarter, the company has to report its financials, among which the most interesting one is the earnings. How much money are they making? And you'll see these analysts will post their expectations. And if their expectations average out to be $1.45, and we only announce $1.36, is that good news or bad news? Bad news, right? But if the analysts on average are expecting $1.25 and we announce $1.36, what's going to happen to the share price that day? It's going to go up, right? And so it's all about expectation. And once again, over time, we would hope that that number goes up, assuming the number of shares stays the same. Now, what about price to earnings ratio? Well, we just talked about the bottom part, EPS. The top is price per share. Where in the world am I going to find the price per share?
Yahoo Finance.
Yahoo Finance. And what would be another name for price per share?
Stock price.
Yeah, it's just the stock price, right? That's just the stock price. And so what we're going to do is take the stock price and divide it by earnings per share. Now, PE ratios vary by industry. So I'll give you some examples here. If we're looking at electric utilities, the PE might be somewhere between 7 and 10. On the S&P 500, which is like almost everything, it's like roughly in the teens. And then if you have some very, very new, exciting companies, it'll be maybe 30 or 35, who knows? What's the difference? The way to think about this is how much are people willing to pay for $1 of current earnings? People would only be willing to pay more for $1 of current earnings if they thought earnings were going to grow faster. And so faster growth means higher PE. Faster growth means higher PE. I have these Chinese EMBA students that come over, and they're always excited to learn about stocks. And they ask me, should I buy low PE stocks? And I say, yes. And they're happy. And they say, wait a minute, should I buy high PE stocks? And I say, yes. Now they're really confused. They say, well, should I buy middle PE stocks? And I say, yes. As we are going to learn in chapter 11, the answer is buy them all. Right? We're going to hold a diversified portfolio. PE ratios are useful when comparing between firms in the same industry. Let me say that again. PE ratios are useful when comparing between firms in the same industry. If a PE of, let's say, Walmart versus Costco. Costco's got a higher PE than Walmart. That means that basically people think Costco's got more growth opportunities, maybe they're executing better. All sorts of reasons they might have a higher PE ratio, but in that case, a higher PE is better. Now let's talk about the market to book ratio. That is the market value per share. Ms. Nuchwanda, where do you think we would get the market value per share? Any idea where to get that information? Maybe we've already talked about it today. Ms. Marina.
Yahoo.
Second.
Yahoo. I don't know how to pronounce it in English.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is that Spanish?
Yahoo.
Okay, does anyone speak Spanish?
Argentinian accent is a little different.
Okay, well my Spanish, so far all I can ask for you is, ayúdame por favor. That's helped me, please, I think. Okay, let me ask someone else. Mr. Bowrichter, where would I get market value per share?
Isn't it just stock price?
It's just the stock price. It's just the stock price. And then we're going to divide that by book value per share. Now, book value per share, let me expand that for you. It is the book value of the equity per share. It is the book value of the equity per share. Now, how are we going to find that? Well, we know that on the balance sheet, we have the assets on this side, and then we have the liabilities and the owner's equity. So all I have to do to find out this owner's equity is to take assets and minus liabilities. However, there may be some preferred shares or something, and so we're not going to include that. We're going to include everything involving common shares. So that's going to be our owner's equity. I'm going to then divide that number by the number of shares outstanding. I'm going to divide that number by the number of shares outstanding, and that's going to give me the book value per share. Now, the book value per share, keep in mind, book value is the historical cost of the asset minus any depreciation that's gone on. In a healthy company, do you think the market to book ratio would be greater than 1 or less than 1? Remember, my operation had no book value because everything had been totally depreciated out. And so my market value was still positive. My book value was 0. Does that, you start to figure out here that the book value typically, in fact, in a healthy company, the book value will always be lower. In fact, this is the way Warren Buffett says to think about it. You guys know Warren Buffett? I'm not a big fan, but he says something right at least twice a day, kind of like a broken clock. Do you know broken clocks right twice a day? Okay, back to the story, except it's digital. Okay, so what does Warren Buffett say? He says that buying a share that has market to book less than 1 is like giving the managers $1 and asking for something less in return. Buying a stock with market to book less than 1 is like giving the managers $1 and asking for something less in return. If that is your life dream, please bring all your dollars to my office and I'll help you out, right? You can give me all your dollars, I'll give you something less in return, we can both leave happy. Now, here's the fun thing. Do you think Warren Buffett could actually get by with buying a firm that had market to book less than 1 and still come out on top? Yeah, how can he do it? Mr. Fisher, what do you think? What can Warren Buffett do that you can't do?
He's got a lot of capital behind him.
He's got a lot of capital behind him, which means he can buy the whole firm. That's step number 1. Buy the whole firm. Step number 2, why do you think the market to book is less than 1? Most likely, the managers suck. If you buy all the shares, what can you do with the managers? Fire them. Now, the next question is this. Who do you replace them with? Do you think Warren just like randomly pulls people off the street? You think he might know some folks? Yeah, he might have some smart, trusted friends that he'd be willing to stick in there. And so Warren Buffett can buy these firms, market to book less than 1, and turn them into something much more valuable. You can't do that, so I don't recommend it. In fact, these books that say, investing the Warren Buffett way, whenever I see one of these, I always open it up. And if the first page doesn't say, get a boatload of money, then I shut it because I know they have no clue what they're talking about, because a lot of Warren's magic is his ability to buy firms that make changes or to buy private companies that the owners don't recognize are undervalued by the money that he's throwing at them. Okay. Let's see, market capitalization, easy peasy. It's just the price per share times the number of shares outstanding. We've already talked about where to get that. That is the market value of the equity for the overall firm. The market capitalization is the market value of the equity for the overall firm. Now, keep in mind, it's just the equity, though. The true value of the firm, the assets, it's equal to total debt plus total equity. And so if you have a firm that is all equity here, it will have a higher market capitalization than a identical firm that is half debt, half equity. Does that make sense? And so market capitalization is kind of a fun thing to talk about. And we talk about Apple having a market capitalization of $1 trillion, but that's not the true value of Apple's operations. And so if we want to find out what their operations are worth, we look at what's called the enterprise value. We look at the enterprise value. We start out with our market capitalization, which we've just calculated. That's the market value of the equity. We add the market value of the interest-bearing debt. What kinds of debts do we have that don't bear interest? How about accounts payable, right? That's not interest-bearing debt. So we'd be looking at things like bonds, notes, bank loans, would be the interest-bearing debt. Now we're going to add that, so now we have debt plus equity. Now we are going to also subtract out the cash. We're going to subtract out the cash because the market capitalization includes the cash at the firm. Can firms hold on to too much cash? Yeah. Apple's market capitalization is inflated because they sit on too much cash. If we want to look at the value of the operations themselves, then we have to subtract out that cash. And so the enterprise value is just the market value of the equity plus the market value of the interest-bearing debt, and then we're going to subtract out the cash. Now, why do we do that? It's going to give us something similar to PE, but on an operational perspective instead of a purely financial perspective. And that is, we're going to take that enterprise value that we just calculated, divide by EBITDA. What do we say EBITDA was? It's a measure, it's an operating measure of profit, right? It is not impacted by the age of the assets, it's not impacted by the capital structure. And so if we do that, we're going to come up with something very similar to PE ratio, only on an operational standpoint. And so it's a way of purely distilling the growth opportunities, perhaps, of the enterprise itself. So once again, amongst identical firms or firms in the same industry, a higher EV multiple, just like PE, will be better than a lower one. A higher EV multiple will be better than a lower one. Questions? Okay, now let's talk about ratio comparisons. So far, it all sounds super easy, but I've made this point a couple of times, and that is that we can only compare ratios between companies in the same industry. For example, in the software industry, anybody have any idea what the profit margins look like?
Very high.
They're high, like 65% high, right? That's pretty sweet. Now, bless you. What do you think about the profit margin on groceries? It's low. It's like 2-3% on a good day. And so what we end up seeing is that if we just compared profit margins, we would say, oh, these people at the grocery store stink, right? You have to look at other firms in the same industry in order to make comparisons. Now, how do grocery stores make up for this excruciatingly low profit margin? What do they do with their inventory? They have to turn it really fast, right? So they get really high inventory turns. And so if you sell a bunch of stuff at 2%, maybe you make as much money as if you sold less stuff at 10%. Does that make sense? By the way, do you want the inventory to turn quickly on the grocery store shelves? Yes, why?
Expiration.
Yeah, stuff expires, stuff goes bad. Every time I go to Price Cutter and I pick something up, I'm like, wow, that looks good. What's the first thing I do? Yeah, people at Walmart pretty good about rotating their stock. Price Cutter depends on the store. So buyer beware. I'm sure there are Walmarts where they don't pay attention either. Okay, now, so that's between different industries, you got to be careful. And even in the same industry with different strategies. I'm going to give you 2 examples here. Number 1 is Home Depot, and number 2 is Ace Hardware. Are they ostensibly in the same industry? Yeah, they're both selling basically the same kind of stuff. But is their strategy different? Yeah, so Home Depot, first of all, Home Depot is not carrying near the breadth of weird little stuff that Ace Hardware will. Now, Ace may only have 2 of them on the shelf, but they're carrying weird little stuff. At Home Depot, they're going to carry stuff that turns more frequently, and stuff that they can buy in higher quantities so they can get better economies of scale. And let's talk about the labor. If you walk into Ace Hardware, in fact, it used to be Ace is the place with the helpful hardware man, right? But then we started letting women sell hardware, and so now it's Ace is a helpful place or something like that, right? And it's perfectly fine for women to sell hardware. Not sexist. Back to the story. So you walk in I'll tell you a true story here. My wife and I bought this house locally, and it had these Japanese toilets called Toto, and named after the dog from Wizard of Oz for whatever reason. And then it wasn't too long, maybe a few years later, my toilet starts making this noise, and it was making that noise. I'm like, what the hell? And so I kind of narrow it down. I'm pretty sure it's that flapper thing that lets the water out of the tank. And so I go to Home Depot and I'm looking at the flappers and none of them look like mine. And there's this young Home Depot guy, probably 18 maybe, and he smells like weed. And he walks up and he says, "Hey man, can I help you?" And I said, "Yeah." I said, "I'm looking for a flapper for my toilet." I said, "This one says it's universal, but it doesn't quite look right." He says, "Of course it'll work, man, it's universal." He must have just smoked, right? Okay, I'm like, do you think I'm gonna trust this guy? No. So get in the car, I drive down the highway, I go to Ace Hardware. And I walk in, and my foot is not even across the threshold before someone says, "Welcome to Ace, can I help you?" And I said, "Yeah, I've got an issue with my toilet." And the guy says, "What's going on?" I said, "It's making this noise." He says, "Is it a Toto?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Has your wife been putting those chlorine tablets in the tank?" Because he knew it wasn't me, right? I said, "Yeah." He says, "Well, unlike other flappers, the flappers in Totos are not resistant to those chemicals. And what happens is they get attacked and they grow brittle over time. And then they start to leak by and they make that noise you just described." Do you think this guy knows what he's talking about? Yeah. Do you know why he knows what he's talking about? He was a plumber, right? I could tell by, you guys know the plumber? Yeah. He's a plumber, right? And I said, "Would you happen to have this flapper?" He says, "Follow me." And I follow him back. By the way, the aisles at Ace are very skinny. They're trying to fit absolutely as many different SKUs, shopkeeping units, in the same store as possible, right? And so we go back, and finally we get to this wall of flappers, and there it is! Only in a deeper blue than mine, because mine was chemically damaged, right? And he says, "Whoop, there you go." What do you think the labor costs look like at Ace versus Home Depot? Yeah, probably higher, because by the way, plumbers, if you can't afford to send your kids to college, send them to plumbing school, right? Just tell them to wear suspenders.
Trucking school's cheaper.
What's that?
Trucking school's cheaper.
Trucking school is cheaper.
And you have less bills.
Yes, but you're more likely to die of coronary problems. Oh, yeah. Oh, hey, I'm related to tons of truckers. They tend to just, well, anyway, back to the story. Yeah. Okay, so you're right, trucking school is cheaper, but you'll live longer and you'll make more money as a plumber. Back to, by the way, do you think truck drivers can be replaced with automation? Yeah. Do you think plumbers can be replaced with automation? No. Another thing to keep in mind. Okay, back to the story. She's always giving me grief. Back to the story. What do you think about inventory turns? What do you think the inventory turns look like at Ace versus Home Depot? They got to be a lot lower. Now, I'll bet the profit margin is higher at Ace. Kind of has to be, or they couldn't put up with these low inventory turns. Do you think I paid a premium to get the flapper that I wanted when I wanted it? Absolutely. Do you think I paid a premium to be able to talk to someone who wasn't high? Absolutely. Now, how many of you actually work at Home Depot or Lowe's? Okay. You know, anyone that does, I'm sure you're not the guy I talked to about the toilet flapper, right? I have to say that for the purpose of the people. Okay, back to the story. So, not even between two firms with different strategies in the same industry can we use ratios to compare. Now let's talk about the second thing. A lot of times you can't apply this bigger or better mentality, bigger is better mentality to ratios. We said that liquidity ratios typically for people looking to loan us money, the higher, the better. But what about for us? Should we be sitting on mountains of liquidity at the firm? Absolutely not, because cash is a really poor investment. Our shareholders could do something else with that cash, so they're not going to want to pay us to sit on it, so we're not going to shoot for the moon on these liquidity ratios. And profit margin, you know, maybe I could get one idiot to buy a Ford Ranger for $500,000. And my profit margin would look great, but what would my sales look like? Right? Does that make sense?